of this program, keep these questions in mind.
What are some properties of the actinide elements?
What is the relationship between radiation and cancer?
Since the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan in 1945, nuclear radiation has been associated with death and destruction. But other applications of radioactivity have safely improved the quality of life for many people.
How can radioactivity be useful?
My uncle used it when he had cancer, and he is in perfect condition now.
Well, I guess if you're trying to evolve a different species a different way to see what will happen.
Radioactivity can be useful because it can power things.
Not like Godzilla or something like that, but just, to see if anything different happens.
Useful? Well, if you're building a bomb, it would be useful.
The group of elements known as the actinide series is at the very bottom of the periodic table. The actinides share some properties with the transition metals, including high melting and boiling points. However, they are all radioactive, and most are artificial, which makes them unique among all the groups in the periodic table. Although these elements are a sub-series of the transition metals, their group has often been considered separately. The actinide series generally includes the 15 elements from actinium to lawrencium. All actinides heavier than uranium are artificially produced, either in a laboratory or as a byproduct of nuclear reactions. Most of the actinides weren't discovered until the 20th century, when technology allowed scientists to create the environments necessary to produce and detect these elements. All the actinides are radioactive. Uranium and plutonium are probably the best known of the series. They gained worldwide recognition as the key components of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan at the end of World War II, and are still vital for nuclear weapons today. But radioactivity can also be beneficial. The actinides are commonly used in cancer treatments and as an efficient heat and power source. The radioactivity of the actinides can be explained by taking a closer look at the periodic table. As you read the periodic table from top to bottom, each horizontal line is called a period. Each period represents the number of electron shells the element's atoms normally have. The actinide series is entirely in period 7, meaning that every atom has 7 electron shells. The electrons in this outermost shell are called valence electrons. It takes 8 valence electrons to fill an outermost electron shell and make an atom stable. The elements are listed in order of their atomic number, which represents the number of protons in an element's nucleus. In an element's normal or ground state, the number of protons in the nucleus is equal to the number of electrons in the shells. The radioactivity of the actinides stems from the nucleus. This is why applications that use radioactivity are described as nuclear. The elements in the actinide series are some of the heaviest elements in the universe, so they have very high atomic numbers. The nuclei of these atoms are so big that normal atomic forces can't hold them together, and they become unstable. The nucleus releases matter and energy in an attempt to gain stability. When this happens, the atom changes or transmutes into a completely new element in a process called radioactive decay. There are several types of decay, each releasing a different form of radiation. Alpha particles are the most common form of radiation in the actinide series. An alpha particle is the same as a helium nucleus with 2 neutrons and 2 protons. When an element undergoes alpha decay, it turns into a new element with 2 fewer protons. For example, americium-241 has 95 protons and 146 neutrons. It experiences alpha decay and becomes neptunium-237 with 93 protons and 144 neutrons. In this equation, the alpha particle is written as helium. Beta particles are electrons, but they are ejected from the nucleus. Beta decay is more common in radioactive isotopes of lighter elements. A beta particle is formed when a neutron in the nucleus turns into a proton and an electron. The electron leaves the nucleus, and the atom transmutes to the element with one more proton. For example, Actinium-227 with 89 protons and 148 neutrons undergoes beta decay and turns into Thorium-227 with 90 protons and 147 neutrons. The beta particle is written here as an electron. The most familiar type of nuclear decay is fission. In fission, the nucleus of an atom splits into smaller nuclei, and energy is released in the form of gamma rays and subatomic particles such as neutrons. When uranium-235 undergoes fission, there are several different nuclei it can split into. Two common products are barium and krypton. Fission is the type of radioactivity predominant in nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons. Many of the actinides result from the radioactive decay of other elements. This understanding of radioactivity was what allowed scientists to isolate and identify all the elements in the actinide series. Did you know? Neptunium was the first actinide to be produced artificially in a laboratory. The element was discovered in 1940 by Edwin McMillan, who later shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for discovering elements heavier than uranium.
Since the beginning of the atomic age, 9 countries have developed nuclear capabilities, and several more are close to producing a nuclear arsenal. Global efforts to control the proliferation of such weapons include peaceful treaties and threats of military action.
In what ways can countries put pressure on others?
Things like the UN, NAFTA, or the EU can put pressure on different countries.
With the ambassadors and going in there and trying to solve it internally without war.
Start a conflict or a war to try to abduct them.
Stop trading with them.
Economic sanctions.
Political sanctions.
I would say that trying to peacefully change the government is one of the best ways. Unfortunately, apparently doesn't work that well.
If we stopped using their products, it would hurt their economies.
Element number 92 on the periodic table is uranium. The atomic symbol for uranium is U. Uranium is a radioactive heavy metal with a silvery appearance. Here, we see a depleted sample of the element. Uranium is named after the planet Uranus, which was identified shortly before the discovery of the element. Classified as a metal in the actinide series, uranium lies in the periodic table's 7th row, period 7. Each atom of uranium consists of a cloud of electrons surrounding a compact nucleus that contains almost all the atom's mass. In the most common form of uranium, its nucleus has 92 positively charged protons, plus 146 uncharged neutrons. Uranium has 92 negatively charged electrons to balance its 92 protons. These electrons are found in 7 orbital shells surrounding the nucleus, which can be visualized as being built up from the nearest preceding noble gas, radon. Radon has 86 electrons distributed in 6 orbital shells. Uranium has 6 more electrons than radon. The first 2 electrons are found in the spherical 7s orbital. The next 3 electrons are distributed in 3 of the 7 lobe-shaped 5f orbitals. And the final electron is in one of the 6-level d orbitals. Only the 2 valence electrons in the 7s orbital shell influence how uranium interacts with other elements. Here we reconstruct Henri Becquerel's 1896 discovery of uranium's radioactivity. In a drawer, some coins and a metal Maltese cross are placed on top of a black light-proof plastic bag containing photographic paper. A uranium sample is placed on top of the cross. The drawer is closed and left undisturbed. After a few days, the objects are removed and the photographic paper is developed. The alpha particles emitted from the uranium have exposed the photographic paper. The metallic objects block these alpha particles, resulting in a reverse silhouette of the original cross and coins. Enriched uranium is mainly used as a fuel for nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors. In a reactor, radioactive decay generates heat, which is used to power the electrical generator. It lurks through the inner space of the world's great oceans. A deep-diving nuclear submarine, armed with more explosive power than has been detonated in all human history.
What is a submarine? A submarine is a steel tube in which we put 3,000-pound hydraulic pipes, 4,500 pounds per square inch high-pressure air. We've got 450-volt AC power, 250-volt DC power. We have fans and pumps. We arm it with the weapons of almost unimaginable destructive power. We propel it with a nuclear reactor, and then we take it out and intentionally sink it in salt water. That's not inherently safe.
It is called a boomer, a name the Navy uses for only its most powerful warships. In 1957, the Soviet Union successfully tested an intercontinental ballistic missile that could reach U.S. soil in less than 30 minutes. The U.S. responded with a nuclear triad, 3 separate defensive systems: aircraft, land-based missiles, and submarines. Together, they underwrote a policy called Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD for short. The land and air-based legs are vulnerable. Boomers are different. Their locations are a mystery, a national secret. That's what makes the underwater leg of the triad so important. They're safe from a first strike. So quiet is the modern sub that finding it would be like searching for a 20-watt light bulb hanging somewhere deep in the Atlantic Ocean.
The principal means by which one detects submarines has been acoustics. 3 types of sounds made by a submarine: the noise of the water passing over the hull. Secondly, the machinery of the submarine, the diesels or the turbines going chug, chug, chug. Third, the propeller. The cavitation, which is the formation and then breaking of minuscule bubbles around the propeller blades. Traditionally, that's been the means of detecting submarines.
Quieting the sub requires state-of-the-art, top-secret technology to mask its acoustic signature. Perhaps the most important stealth system on the sub is also the most secret: the nuclear reactor. The design is classified, and yet its function is straightforward. Uranium in the reactor is split by neutrons, releasing more neutrons and generating heat. The heat produces steam, which drives the turbines that power the boat and the generator that provides it with electricity. Before atomic power, diesel subs had to surface regularly to breathe and recharge batteries. Modern nuclear subs can go for more than 20 years without refueling. Silence, stealth, and secrecy make the submarine nearly invulnerable. Missile-firing subs are this nation's ultimate insurance policy. More than half of the U.S. nuclear arsenal rides on boomers.
I personally believe very, very strongly in the whole idea of strategic deterrence. I think that history shows it very clearly if you look back over the last 40 or 50 years that it's worked.
Recognize that our job is not to launch. Just the opposite. Our job is to make sure that we never find ourselves in a position where we're contemplating doing that.
My mission is actually quite simple. Be ready to launch these missiles when directed with little or no probability of anybody's interfering with that action. We do that by remaining undetected, at sea, covert, unlocated by anybody.
Did you know the U.S. Navy has one of the best records of nuclear reactor safety? It has experienced no major accidents since 1954, when the USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine, was commissioned.
When a smoke detector alerts people to a fire, the chance of death is cut in half. Today, about 88% of homes in the U.S. have working smoke alarms.
Does your home have a smoke alarm?
I have a smoke detector because if we have a fire, it'll go off and it'll save my life.
I have a smoke detector in my house because if there's something I can use so I don't die in a fire while I'm sleeping.
Yeah, but I don't know if it works because we've never had a fire.
Yes, I have a smoke detector in my house. It's in my kitchen because I'm not very good at cooking.
Element number 95 on the periodic table is americium. The atomic symbol for americium is Am. A silvery, shiny radioactive metal, americium is denser than lead. It is present as an oxide in the ionizing detector seen here, which has been removed from a smoke detector. Americium is named after the Americas. Classified as a metal in the Actinides series, americium lies in the periodic table's 7th row, period 7. Each atom of americium consists of a cloud of electrons surrounding a compact nucleus that contains almost all the atom's mass. In the most common form of americium, its nucleus has 95 positively charged protons, plus 148 uncharged neutrons. Americium has 95 negatively charged electrons to balance its 95 protons. These electrons are found in 7 orbital shells surrounding the nucleus, which can be visualized as being built up from the nearest preceding noble gas, radon. Radon has 86 electrons distributed in 6 orbital shells. Americium has 9 more electrons than radon. The first 2 electrons are found in the spherical 7s orbital. The remaining 7 electrons are distributed among the 7 lobe-shaped 5f orbitals. Since the electrons in the 5f orbital are at a lower energy than those in the 7s orbital, only the 2 valence electrons in this 7th level shell influence how americium interacts with other elements. Inside most smoke detectors is a small amount of americium oxide. The radioactivity of the americium allows a small, steady electric current to flow through the air between 2 electrodes. When smoke enters this space, it disrupts the electric current, setting off an alarm. Compared to the insignificant radiation hazard they pose, smoke detectors save many lives every year. The only current application of americium is in smoke detectors. The old saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. But smoke by itself is enough to kill. In fact, the #1 cause of fire-related deaths is smoke inhalation. Smoke from a fire causes problems both by taking away oxygen necessary for breathing and by producing poisonous gases. Some substances damage the lungs, while others, such as carbon monoxide, interfere on a cellular level. The best way to combat smoke inhalation is by prevention. And smoke detectors provide a crucial early warning in the advent of fire. In the early 1940s, a Swiss inventor named Ernst Maly developed the first smoke detector to use an electric current across an ionized space. Then, in the 1960s, an American scientist named Glenn Seaborg patented a method for producing americium in plutonium reactors. The two processes finally came together in the early 1970s, when several different patents were issued for ionizing smoke detectors using a radioactive substance. Today, americium is a necessary component of most ionizing smoke detectors. Americium smoke detectors use a combination of low-level radioactivity and electricity to provide a vital warning system against smoke and fire. The americium in smoke detectors undergoes alpha decay, so it is constantly giving off alpha particles. These particles pose no health hazard and actually save lives in the event of a fire. The alpha particles are positively charged, and by interacting with other atoms in the air, they create a small area of ions within the smoke detector. A small amount of electricity is able to travel across this ionized air. Smoke is the result of incomplete combustion. It consists of fine particles of carbon or soot suspended in a mixture of air and hot gases. When smoke is present, the soot absorbs the alpha particles and ions are not formed. Without the ions in the air, the electricity cannot cross the space in the detector and the current stops. The lack of current is what sets off the alarm. If the smoke dissipates, the ionization is resumed and the alarm stops. Smoke detectors are sensitive enough to sound the alarm several minutes before a blaze becomes out of control. The time provided by americium-based smoke detectors is absolutely vital to people who might otherwise be trapped by fire. Did you know? Smoke detectors take two forms. The ionizing type uses americium, and the photoelectric type relies on the properties of light. The photoelectric detector has no radioactive components, but it is more expensive and less effective than an ionizing smoke detector.
Cancer is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. While some types of cancer are related to genetics, the disease is often caused by preventable environmental factors.
What are some things that can cause cancer?
Cancer can be caused by smoking.
Smoking.
Cigarettes can cause cancer.
Leading an unhealthy lifestyle.
Certain environmental conditions, I guess, like pollution, things like that.
Staying out in the sun too long.
If you work with radiation, you can get cancer.
It is genetic, like it is passed down through families.
My friend lost both of his parents to cancer, which I think would suggest that the area that he lived in had environmental factors that were conducive to cancer.
Element number 98 on the periodic table is californium. The atomic symbol for californium is Cf. Californium has never been seen with the naked eye. Like all elements heavier than uranium, it is radioactive and does not exist naturally on Earth. Californium is named after the state of California, where it was first made. Californium is classified as a metal in the actinide series. It lies in the periodic table's 7th row, period 7. Each atom of californium consists of a cloud of electrons surrounding a compact nucleus that contains almost all the atom's mass. In the most stable form of californium, its nucleus has 98 positively charged protons, plus 153 uncharged neutrons. Californium has 98 negatively charged electrons to balance its 98 protons. These electrons are found in 7 orbital shells surrounding the nucleus, which can be visualized as being built up from the nearest preceding noble gas, radon. Radon has 86 electrons distributed among 6 orbital shells. Californium has 12 more electrons than radon. The first 2 electrons are found in the spherical 7s orbital shell. The next 10 electrons are distributed among 7 lobe-shaped 5f orbitals. Since the 10 electrons in the 5f orbital are at a lower energy than those in the 7s orbital, only the 2 valence electrons in the 7th level shell influence how californium interacts with other elements. Californium was first made in 1950 by a team of scientists at the laboratory at Berkeley, California. They bombarded curium with helium ions and made just enough californium to identify it as a new element. There are 8 known isotopes of californium. Californium is a good source of neutrons, the basis for most of its uses. It is used for geological analysis in gold mining and oil wells, and for the treatment of cervical cancer. Cancer is a serious disease that afflicts people from all walks of life. But many patients diagnosed with cancer have several options for treatment and go on to live long, healthy lives. This was not always the case. Up until the beginning of the 20th century, the only treatment was surgery, but it was often dangerous and could prove as deadly as the disease.
Prior to 1955, cancer was thought of as equal to death. The word cancer was equated with death.
So the doctor would tell the patient, well, there seems to be a little lump or there's a growth here and we'll take care of it. And they would proceed to treat the person, oftentimes without ever telling them that they had cancer.
By the early 1950s, scientists had begun developing a clear understanding of radiation and its effect on human cells. They discovered that high doses of focused radiation improved the condition of people with certain types of skin cancer and other tumors that were beyond the reach of surgery. But early X-ray radiation therapy was not a miracle cure. It had unpleasant side effects and occasionally caused other types of cancer.
A lot of the long-term survivors, due to the amount of radiation that we had back in the leukemia days, developed breast cancer as a secondary deal.
And some cancers wouldn't even respond to treatment. To reduce side effects and improve response rates, researchers began experimenting with an internal radiation source. In the 1970s, clinical trials at the University of Kentucky began using californium-252 brachytherapy to treat cervical cancer. Brachytherapy is a method that involves placing a radiation source close to or inside a tumor itself. Its proximity to the cancer cells allows a higher dose of radiation to be delivered, making less of an impact on nearby healthy cells compared to external radiation. The high-energy neutron radiation of californium has proved especially effective in treating cancers that do not respond to other types of radiation therapy and cancers in advanced stages of development. Regular screening has significantly reduced the number of cervical cancer cases requiring intense radiotherapy treatment. But the success of californium brachytherapy suggests great potential in treating other types of cancer and provides continuing hope to women diagnosed with cervical cancer.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
What are some properties of the actinide elements?
What is the relationship between radiation and cancer? If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
As you watch the second half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
Why did scientists start work on the atomic bomb?
Why were scientists uneasy about working on the Manhattan Project?
Some people think science has no relation to daily life, but many scientific discoveries have made a great impact in areas that aren't necessarily considered scientific. One such discovery was atomic energy.
How has nuclear energy affected the way we live today?
They've made new technology for nuclear activity.
It impacts a lot of people's lives that work in nuclear power plants because you can get pretty seriously injured if you work in or around a nuclear power plant, and, you know, God knows if something goes wrong.
I really don't agree with nuclear energy because I just feel like it's not a good thing.
But the most important thing of how it's affected history is the nuclear bomb. Not only did it end World War II, but it started the entire Cold War, and like nothing would be the same if that happened. History would be completely different. There's no way to tell how things would be.
We live in a world haunted by the specter of weapons that could kill more people than all the wars in history combined. It all started worlds away from military war rooms in the city of Cambridge, England. This is where science first realized the alchemist's dream of transforming one element into another. In 1919, the scientist Ernest Rutherford first transmuted one element to another, starting the chain of events that led inexorably to the age of the atom bomb.
The 1920s were a fantastically exciting time in physics throughout Europe because you had the development of a new physics dealing with subatomic matter. It's very much an international community, quite a small community. What drove them was the sheer intellectual excitement of the discoveries that were being made.
Some of those involved, like Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, were already well known in contemporary science. But another generation of promising young physicists was emerging.
There was sort of feeling of community among scientists. It felt like one family from all over the world. Well, there was hardly any national boundary as far as science is concerned. Science is universal. Its methods, its ethics are universal. And there is no problem such as having a British science or an American science or a Russian science. They all think in the same way, using the same methodology, the same way of reasoning. And all the science is open in those days, so everybody knew what other people are doing. So in this sense, scientists formed at that stage this family. They're almost citizens of the world, if you like. No boundaries in this respect.
One of the men who studied under Rutherford in the 1920s was to play a crucial role in the race to build a bomb. He was a brilliant American scientist named Robert Oppenheimer, who arrived in the summer of 1926 at the age of 22. His name would later become synonymous with America's A-bomb. For all these students, chemistry and physics belonged to detached inquiry, not a path to knowledge that could destroy humankind.
They used to meet at conferences, and their main concern was about science itself, and the idea that science, how it affects society, the overall community, entered very little. One might put it briefly, many of them lived in an ivory tower, and they felt that because they're only investigating nature, and nature has no connections with human feelings, therefore science should not be concerned with the way how science affects the society as a whole.
Few of them seemed to realize the dangerous potential of their work.
Rutherford himself did not believe that we should be able to utilize the energy contained in the nucleus. He thought it would be impossible. In fact, at one of the meetings in Cambridge, he said anybody who speaks about the utilization of nuclear energy is talking moonshine.
Within 10 years' time, the tightly knit scientific community would be ripped apart as a new force of evil stormed over Europe. Adolf Hitler caused thousands of Germans to leave their homeland. Among them were some of the world's top scientists. Still, Hitler had his loyalists who hoped his policies would rescue them from poverty. And not all scientists fled. some of those who remained were to make a breakthrough that changed the course of history. They deliberately split a uranium atom, releasing enormous energy as a byproduct of nuclear fission. The news spread quickly through the scientific world. In Russia, Yuli Karaton, a former Rutherford student, read with fascination what the Germans had done.
It was obvious to people like us, who'd been working with explosives for years, that something terrible like an atomic explosion could not be discounted.
In Cambridge, Rudolf Perls, a German refugee, also saw the military implications.
When we decided that an atom bomb was possible and not excessive in size, we immediately thought that the Germans might have realized the same thing and might be ahead of us. And an atom bomb in the hands of Hitler would have been frightening.
In America, too, the scientific world was worried about the news, but the general public didn't seem to take it seriously. In April 1939, the New York Times ran this story about a meeting of distinguished physicists. Tempers and temperatures increased visibly among members of the American Physical Society as they closed their spring meeting with arguments over the probability of some scientists blowing up a sizable portion of the Earth with a tiny amount of uranium. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began.
In zügigem Vormarsch nahmen unsere Soldaten alle polnischen Stellungen.
For the scientists, it marked the start of a terrible moral dilemma.
It's not the job of a scientist to make bombs. The job of a scientist, if it has to be an objective, is to try to do something which will help humanity. And therefore, to try to make an atom bomb, a weapon of mass destruction, was completely abhorrent to a scientist. Then people began to realize that if Hitler goes ahead, if he acquires the bomb, if the bomb can be made, if he acquires the bomb, this will help him to win the war. In which case, all the humanitarian principles of which we stand would have been abolished.
It was left to a scientist remaining in Germany to spell out the threat. In April 1941, he smuggled a message to old friends who had fled to America.
We got a message through a refugee physicist which said essentially, we know how to make nuclear explosions, hurry up.
From then on, the specter of a German A-bomb would loom large for the rest of the world. The Soviet Union remained at peace in the early days of the war. Still, it took nothing for granted and kept close watch on its neighbors. At work in England, Soviet spies acquired a copy of a top-secret summary of plans in the United Kingdom and in America to begin building an atom bomb.
On Soviet-Russian soil, in spite of the careful preparations of the defenders, the German Wehrmacht has captured vast stretches of territory.
But in June 1941, before Moscow could act on the stolen secrets, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The Russians would suffer devastating losses, which nearly destroyed the country. In the fall of 1942, New Mexico was swarming with military men looking for the right place to build an atomic bomb. They chose a boys' school called Los Alamos. Within a year, the school would be transformed into a large laboratory complex. It would become the birthplace of the world's first nuclear weapon. The Los Alamos team included many European refugees. If some were uneasy about the task before them, they firmly believed the mere threat of a bomb could force Hitler to back down. Niels Bohr, who had worked with Rutherford and was one of the founders of nuclear physics, also contributed. Robert Oppenheimer led the team. He seemed to offer the right combination of energy and expertise.
Because people have respected him, he managed to keep them all together. There are many prima donnas in Los Alamos, and they all to go in different ways. But somehow he managed to do this by the way his organizational skill.
Joseph Rotblat was one of those who came from Europe to join Oppenheimer in Los Alamos. They all came under the ultimate control of General Leslie Groves, who was dismayed at the casual way the scientists approached their jobs.
In first instance, he wanted to put all scientists in uniform and give them ranks and so on. Secondly, he wanted to keep each scientist in a separate compartment so they wouldn't at all communicate with each other. He was very concerned about security and secrecy. Of course, science doesn't work. The only way scientists work is by talking to each other, trying to get new ideas coming out from such conversations. And so it didn't work. In fact, it was Oppenheimer who convinced him that it wouldn't work.
Oppenheimer, I think, wanted to draw the best people in to work on the bomb. It was a very challenging problem. And he realized that to involve the best scientists, he would need to give them conditions in which they could talk to one another, to continue the kind of exchange that had really characterized nuclear physics and certainly characterized the early discussions about an atomic bomb in the United States. So Los Alamos was a very isolated place where there was great secrecy about what was going on there, but within the laboratory itself there was an attempt to ensure that people could talk and to generate ideas and move the project ahead as quickly as possible.
Though the more than 500 scientists could talk to one another, security was tight. Groves wanted to keep the work secret, not only from Hitler, but also from any other country whose policies America feared, including its so-called ally, the Soviet Union. President Franklin D. Roosevelt met British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Quebec, Canada, in August 1943. At Churchill's suggestion, the Russians weren't invited. After the public greetings and behind closed doors, they agreed that the United States and the United Kingdom would pool their atomic secrets and their atomic scientists. Although the irate Soviets had been excluded from the talks, they got an unexpected bonus. Klaus Fuchs, a scientist who had been steadily supplying intelligence to spies in England, received orders to move to the U.S. Once Fuchs got to Los Alamos, the spying became relatively easy, in part because Oppenheimer insisted that communication between scientists be open.
We had complete freedom to converse with any scientist who had a white badge. This was partly due to Oppi. He insisted on that.
Hans Bethe was one of those with a white badge, as was the man he supervised, Klaus Fuchs.
Klaus Fuchs was very reticent. He wouldn't give anything by himself except science. He wouldn't talk about personal things. My friend Jenya Piers, Mrs. Piers, said you have to drop a penny into the slot to make him talk. Scientifically, however, he was very good.
Under Oppenheimer, the scientists at Los Alamos worked long hours 6 days a week to try to put an end to a terrible war.
What motivated them initially was fear that the Germans were going to get the bomb. And so they were building this thing. They weren't really building it to use it. They were building it so that they could have, in case Germany did get the bomb, we would have our own bomb, and it would be a stalemate with regard to nuclear weapons. So I don't think many of them seriously considered that it was going to be used. And there was all this euphemistic language. I mean, they weren't building a bomb; they were building a gadget.
But the more the gadget took shape, the more doubt some of the scientists had about the project. The threat from Hitler was fading fast. Why was a weapon of mass destruction still needed? At dinner one night in 1944, the military boss at Los Alamos surprised the scientists.
Groves said to us, you realize, of course, that the whole purpose of the project is to subdue the Russians. Now, I remember these words almost as they were spoken yesterday, because they came to me with such a shock. I couldn't believe my own ears. The shock came to me because, first of all, this was not the purpose of the bomb at all. This should be used against another nation. And secondly, because at that time, the Russians were our allies. We had a mortal enemy, and they were carrying the main burden of the war against Germany. And here I'm told, what we are doing now is to subdue these people.
Although Groves' view was not official, the very fact that the Soviets had been excluded from the Allied atomic effort disturbed Niels Bohr.
He thought if people could realize the common danger that faced the human race, then people would be led to cooperate, so that if the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain and other states understood just what the atomic bomb meant, the threat that it posed to everyone, then they would be brought to cooperate and to avoid an arms race. But he feared that if Stalin were not told before the bomb was tested, then so much distrust would be engendered by that secrecy that it would be impossible to bring about that cooperation.
Bohr spoke with Churchill about his concerns, but the British Prime Minister gave him a chilly reception.
He didn't even let him speak for the half hour that had been allotted to him, and told him, well, Mr. Bohr, you are a great scientist. When you want to talk to me about science, I am terribly interested, but these political matters are our business.
Meanwhile, the war was reaching a turning point. The Russians, who'd lost close to 20 million people in the long years of fighting, were now pounding their way into Berlin. Victory in Europe was virtually won. Hitler was beaten, and the need for the atomic bomb as originally defined was over. But there was still another enemy. And the American military was reluctant to let their money and their long years of hard work on the Manhattan Project go to waste. Japan would become the Americans' next target. In the summer of 1945, Niels Bohr returned to Denmark, even more disillusioned and worried. Fearing an apocalyptic arms race, he tried to make his voice heard.
He foresaw that if the Americans go on by themselves together with the British, and then the Russians will go on their own, they make their own bomb, there will be an arms race, which will have enormous consequences, dire consequences for the whole of our civilization. And he tried to prevent this.
In July 1945, at a site codenamed Trinity, the first atomic bomb was wheeled out for testing. The elements in the Actinide series were the most suitable for an atomic bomb. Scientists had settled on two designs, one using uranium and the other using plutonium. The plutonium design was more complicated and it required testing.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now.
it was just tremendous. And first it was brilliant white, and then as it rose in the atmosphere, it became dominantly purple. The gamma rays give you then this purple light that's radiation from the air. So it was a tremendous spectacle, and we all were aware what kind of a weapon it was.
When they actually saw the result at the Trinity test, they were really flattened. I mean, it's one thing to do a calculation on a piece of paper that you're going to get a quarter of a mile fireball and it's going to be 20,000 tons or whatever, and the surface temperature is going to be the temperature of the sun. It's another thing to actually see it. They were really flattened by it when it hit them what they had done.
The very next day, President Harry Truman was able to tell his allies he had a super weapon ready to beat the Japanese. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the bomb and destroyed the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The actinide elements had changed the meaning of war.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
Why did scientists start work on the atomic bomb?
Why were scientists uneasy about working on the Manhattan Project?
We hope you've enjoyed this assignment discovery analysis of the Actinide series. If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.